The spring of 1903 came hard to the Bighorn Basin, the way it sometimes does in Wyoming when the snowpack above the ridgelines holds all winter and then releases in a single week. The ground had been saturated through April. The lower slopes of the Owl Creek Range were running with melt, and the soil beneath the cedar and sage was soft enough that a man could push a fence post into it with one hand. On the morning of May the 2nd, a section of the upper ridge above the Kirby Creek drainage gave way. There was no warning that anyone reported. A rancher named Douglas Prewitt, working cattle a half-mile downslope, said later that he heard what he thought was thunder before he saw the ridge move. What fell was not a simple debris slide. The face of the ridge did not crumble and roll. It separated, cleanly, as though something beneath it had given way all at once, and a section of the upper formation, solid sandstone and consolidated shale, perhaps 40 feet across and 3 times that in height, dropped and split on the valley floor below. Prewitt rode to the base of the debris field when the dust settled. The ridge above him had opened. Where the face had been, there was now a cavity, dark and angled back into the rock, large enough, Prewitt said, that he could not see the back of it from where he stood. He left it alone that first day. The material at the edges was still shifting, and a man who has worked around stone knows the difference between a slope that has finished moving and one that is only pausing. He came back the next morning. He came back again the morning after that. And on the third day, when the loose rock at the threshold had settled into place and the smell of fresh dust had gone out of the air, he walked inside. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. What Prewitt found when he walked into that cavity was not what a man expects to find inside a mountain. The interior was not a natural void. The walls were not raw stone, not the broken face of a fracture, not the rough ceiling of a collapsed seam. The walls were worked. The stone had been dressed, not uniformly, not in the way a mason would cut a block for a wall, but in a way that removed the sharp irregularity of natural fracture and left a surface that was flat enough to have been intentional. The ceiling, where it had not collapsed, ran level for a distance Prewitt estimated at 30 feet before descending into debris. The floor was stone, and the stone of the floor was not the same stone as the walls. It was darker, finer grained, and it had been laid in sections, like a pavement, and the air inside was wrong. Prewitt was not a man who left testimony lightly. He had ranched that country for 11 years, had worked mines in Carbon County before that, and understood the difference between the stale, dead air of a sealed fissure and the ordinary air of a space with passage in it. The air in the cavity was neither. It was fresh. Not the coolness of deep stone, not the sharp chemical edge of a recently disturbed mineral seam, but the quality of open air, moving air, the kind of air that belongs in a meadow or a river valley, in a space that the landslide had only just opened to the sky for what the evidence would later suggest was the first time in a very long time. He stood at the threshold for several minutes before he stepped across it, and he told the Hot Springs County Historical Society 28 years later that the thing that stopped him at the entrance was not fear of the ceiling, or the debris, or the dark. It was the air. He had expected the dead air of sealed stone, and what met him was something else entirely, and he did not yet have words for why that mattered. The geology of the Owl Creek Range at that point on the drainage is not complicated, and that is precisely what makes the cavity so difficult to account for. The range is a classic laramide uplift, the same compressional event that built most of Wyoming's mountain architecture during the late Cretaceous and early Tertiary periods. The exposed stratigraphy along the Kirby Creek drainage runs from Jurassic Age marine limestone at the base through layers of Cretaceous sandstone and shale, capped by tertiary volcanic material on the highest ridgelines. The ridge that collapsed on May the 2nd sat in the middle of that sequence, in a zone of Cretaceous sandstone that is consolidated, dense, and does not produce natural voids of any significant size through the ordinary action of groundwater or frost. There is no natural process that produces dressed walls inside that sequence. Laramide compression fractures stone, it does not smooth it. Glacial action can polish limestone, but the nearest evidence of Pleistocene glaciation is several ridges to the north, and the cavity Prewitt described was not limestone. It was sandstone on the walls, fine dark stone on the floor, and neither of those materials polishes under the forces that built that range. The nearest outcrops of the fine-grained dark stone that Prewitt and later observers described on the floor are found on the eastern face of the range several miles distant, in a volcanic formation of a completely different age and origin than the sandstone that surrounds the cavity. Stone does not migrate between formations on its own, it is carried, and what Prewitt walked into, when the debris cleared and the air moved against his face, was a space that had been constructed rather than formed. The mountain had been opened from inside before anyone opened it from outside. The question of what built the room inside that ridge connects to a problem that the official account of human presence in the Bighorn Basin has never adequately addressed. The accepted chronology of human habitation in central Wyoming begins with the Paleo-Indian cultures of the early Holocene, roughly 10,000 years before the present, and moves forward through a sequence of nomadic and semi-nomadic peoples whose material record consists almost entirely of surface artifacts, projectile points, camp debris, bison processing sites, the remnants of a mobile life adapted to the high plains and basin environment. What that chronology does not account for is the class of construction that requires quarrying, transport of heavy material across significant distance, dressing of stone to a repeatable specification, and the creation of enclosed architectural space that is then concealed within a mountain formation. The Bighorn Basin is not without evidence of deliberate stoneworking that the standard chronology struggles to accommodate. The Medicine Wheel on the northern end of the range, a large circular structure of laid stone on a high ridgeline, has been formally documented and debated by archaeologists for more than a century, without a settled conclusion about its age or the identity of its builders. It is not the kind of structure that the accepted mobile cultures of the region are understood to have produced, and it does not stand alone as an anomaly in the physical record of that country. The cavity at Kirby Creek, if it is what the surviving evidence suggests it is, belongs to the same category of material question. Stone worked to a purpose, in a location that required planning and effort and the transport of materials from elsewhere, by hands that the official chronology of the continent has not yet placed and has not, as of any published record, seriously attempted to place. Word of the opening reached Thermopolis within a week, which was the nearest town of any size and the seat of what was then administered under Fremont County before Hot Springs County was formally organized. A deputy county surveyor named Emil Bracht rode out to the Kirby Creek site on May the 11th, 9 days after the collapse. Bracht was not a trained geologist, but he was a competent field man who had surveyed water claims and mining boundaries across central Wyoming for 6 years. And his field notes from that visit have survived, held in a private family collection in Riverton, where his granddaughter kept them among his professional papers. Bracht recorded the interior dimensions as best he could measure them with the equipment he carried. The visible chamber ran 32 feet from the threshold to the point where ceiling debris blocked further passage, was 14 feet at its widest, and the ceiling at the highest point cleared 8 feet above the floor. He noted the floor stone separately from the wall material, described the dressed surface of the walls as having a consistent angle of cut that ran diagonally across the face rather than horizontally, and recorded that a section of the floor near the far wall had been broken by a falling stone from the ceiling, exposing a gap beneath the floor pavement. He pushed a surveying rod into that gap. The rod, 4 feet in length, found no resistance before he stopped pushing it. Whatever lay beneath the floor of the chamber was open space, not packed sediment or solid rock. Before Bracht left the site on his first visit, he spoke at length with Prewitt, who had been back to the cavity twice more since his initial entry. Prewitt told him about a detail that does not appear in Bracht's formal field notes, but is recorded in a brief personal diary entry that sits beside the professional papers in the Riverton collection. Prewitt said that on his second visit, after his eyes had adjusted to the interior, he noticed markings on the lower section of the dressed wall to the right of the entrance. Not carvings in the conventional sense, not pictographs or symbols of the kind found on exposed sandstone faces elsewhere in the basin. These were shallow lines cut into the dressed surface at a consistent depth, running horizontally at a height of roughly 3 feet from the floor, and they were spaced at regular intervals for as far into the chamber as Prewitt could follow them in the available light. He did not count them, he did not copy them. He described them to Bracht as looking like a measure, like the kind of marks a carpenter makes on a board when he is laying out regular divisions. What they divided, and what they recorded, he could not say. Bracht's diary entry does not indicate that he went back into the chamber to look for them on his own visits, and they do not appear anywhere in his formal field notes or on his plan. Bracht drew a plan of the chamber as he measured it. The plan is in the same collection as the notes. The chamber does not run straight back into the mountain. It bends, very slightly, to the north, and the bend is not the result of a natural fracture line in the rock, because Bracht noted that the dressed surface of the wall continued through the bend without interruption. A natural fracture follows the stress lines of the formation. This wall did not. Whatever the cavity was, it had been shaped to include that turn, which means whoever shaped it had a reason for the angle and the ability to execute it in stone. The threshold, the point at which the opened face of the ridge met the interior, showed a section of floor stone that was worn in a depression perhaps 2 inches deep and running the full width of the opening, a smooth concave dish in material as hard as the basalt those outcrops produce. Bracht noted this in 3 words in his field notes: floor stone worn. He did not elaborate on what he thought it meant. He drew it on the plan, a curved line across the threshold, and labeled it with a question mark. The question mark is still there, in pencil, on a piece of surveying paper that has been folded and unfolded enough times that the crease lines have worn through in 2 places. By the time Bracht made his second visit, on May the 18th, there were other people at the site. A mineral surveyor from Casper named George Aldis had arrived with 2 assistants and was taking samples from the wall surfaces and from the floor stone. Aldis was working for a consortium of Casper investors who held several pending mineral claims in the Owl Creek region and whose interest in the site was straightforward. They wanted to know if the opened cavity indicated the presence of a workable seam. Aldis spent 2 days at the site. He took samples of both the wall sandstone and the dark floor material. He measured the chamber and noted the threshold depression and the gap in the floor where Bracht's rod had found open space. He prepared a report for his clients. That report has not been found in any business or legal record in Wyoming. The Casper investors whose names appear in the adjacent mineral claim records from that period dissolved their consortium in the spring of 1904, less than a year after Aldis submitted whatever he found. The samples he collected were not submitted to any state or federal assay office whose records survive. What Aldis found in those samples, and what he told his clients, is not in any accessible record. What is known is that within 3 weeks of his visit, the Casper Consortium filed no further claims in the Owl Creek drainage and pursued no further inquiry into the site, and Aldis himself relocated his practice to Denver, where he worked in hard rock mining consultation until 1912 and is not recorded as having returned to Wyoming on any professional matter. The federal presence at the site came later than the county presence and was, by the record, more limited. A field agent from the General Land Office, the agency responsible at that time for public land surveys and mineral claim oversight across the federal territories and states of the West, visited the Kirby Creek site in late June of 1903. His name was Thomas Canfield, and his visit is documented only in a single line in the Cheyenne District Office log. Site inspection, Kirby Creek drainage, June 22nd. No actionable mineral claim indicated. Canfield's field report from that inspection, which would have included his physical description of the site and his assessment of the chamber interior, is not in the General Land Office records that were transferred to the Bureau of Land Management and are now held at the National Archives in Denver. The Cheyenne district records for 1903 were subject to a reorganization and partial destruction in 1919 during a consolidation of federal land administration offices across Wyoming. That reorganization touched the records of one district surveyor's office and no others. Canfield himself was transferred to the Portland, Oregon district office in August of 1903, 2 months after his Kirby Creek inspection, and does not appear in any further Wyoming land records. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The Shoshone people had held the Wind River country for generations before the reservation boundaries of 1868 were drawn, and the Owl Creek Range formed the eastern wall of what they knew as a landscape with a long human history layered into its stone. The oral record of the Eastern Shoshone does not describe the Kirby Creek cavity by name, which is expected given that the cavity was sealed until 1903 and its location was not within the traditional travel corridors that run through the lower basin. What the oral record does contain, and what was documented by the ethnographer Omar Stewart during his fieldwork among the Eastern Shoshone in the 1930s, is a category of place described in Shoshone oral tradition as a location that breathes, a place inside the rock where the air is alive in a way that does not belong to the stone around it. Stewart recorded 3 separate accounts from elders that used this phrase or its equivalent, all referring to locations in the Owl Creek and adjacent Wind River ranges. He published a portion of this fieldwork in a regional anthropological journal in 1941. The 3 accounts of breathing places were not included in that publication. They appear in Stewart's unpublished field notes, which are held at the University of Colorado Archives in Boulder, catalogued in 1987 and examined by at least 2 researchers in the years since, neither of whom published on the specific category of site Stewart's informants described, and neither of whom appears to have connected Stewart's field notes to the county surveyor's records from Kirby Creek, because no one had yet placed those 2 bodies of material beside each other and asked what they shared. What the evidence at Kirby Creek shows, when the surviving record is laid against what the geology cannot produce on its own, comes down to a small number of facts that the ordinary explanations do not reach. The dressed walls are the first. Sandstone does not organize itself into planed surfaces with consistent diagonal cut marks running through the face of a formation that has been consolidated for millions of years. The diagonal angle of the dressing that Bracht recorded is not the angle at which natural fracture occurs in that formation, and it is not the angle produced by any extractive or exploratory process a mining operation would use. It is the angle used in stone shaping when the goal is to create a surface rather than to remove material. The floorstone is the second, the dark, fine-grained material that Prewitt described and Bracht documented separately from the wall rock matches no formation in the immediate vicinity of the Kirby Creek drainage. The nearest equivalent is found several miles east in a volcanic outcrop of a completely different geological age. Stone of that type does not migrate. It was carried, cut, and laid. The threshold depression is the third, a 2-inch concave dish worn across the full width of an entrance, in material as resistant as volcanic basalt, requires a volume of repeated passage that no casual or occasional use would produce. The surface records what crossed it, and what crossed it was enough to leave a permanent mark in some of the hardest material in that region. The fresh air is the fourth, and it is the one the geological record cannot accommodate at all. A sealed cavity inside a compressed and consolidated mountain formation holds its air from the moment of sealing. The oxygen depletes as it reacts with mineral surfaces over time. Carbon dioxide accumulates, the humidity stabilizes at a level determined by the moisture content of the surrounding stone. A cavity that has been sealed for centuries, let alone longer, will not contain air that a man raised in the open would describe as fresh and moving. The only condition under which a sealed cavity holds air with the character of movement is the condition in which the cavity is not fully sealed, in which some passage connects it to the atmosphere by a route the landslide did not expose. Prewitt was clear on what he met at the threshold. Bracht did not address air quality in his field notes, but he also recorded no difficulty breathing and no sign of the depleted atmosphere a fully sealed void would hold. The cavity was breathing, and the floor beneath it, where Bracht's surveying rod dropped 4 feet into open space without finding resistance, suggests the passage that allowed it to breathe ran downward, through whatever lay beneath the dark stone floor, into a depth and extent that no one in 1903 had the tools or the authorization to follow. Douglas Prewitt ranched the Kirby Creek drainage until 1917, when drought and falling cattle prices ended the operation. He did not leave a formal written account of what he found in the cavity beyond the summary recorded by Margaret Toll of the Hot Springs County Historical Society in 1931. In that summary, Prewitt is described as saying that the room in the rock was not dug. He had worked enough mines and cellars to know the difference between a space that someone had excavated by removing material and a space that had been built by shaping and adding. The distinction he was drawing is precise. A mine shaft removes stone from a mountain. A room is made by finishing the stone that remains in place and bringing in what is not native to the site. The floor stone at Kirby Creek was not native. The walls were shaped, not excavated. The entrance was worn by passage, not by tools. Prewitt, who was not a man given to elaboration, said in 1931 that what he walked into in May of 1903 was a room with a floor someone had laid, walls someone had finished, and an entrance worn by whatever had used it going in. The secondary collapse that Bracht had anticipated came in the winter of 1904, when the freeze-thaw cycle in the exposed cavity face brought down additional material from the fractured upper formation. By the spring of 1905, the entrance to the chamber had been reduced to a gap too narrow for a man to pass through upright. There is no record of any subsequent formal examination of the site. The General Land Office records that should document Canfield's inspection are absent from every archive that holds the relevant series. Aldis's mineral report to his consortium has not surfaced in any business record, legal filing, or personal paper. The cavity itself, beneath the decades of additional weathering and collapse that a Wyoming ridgeline delivers without pause, is still there. The mountain did not remove what was built inside it. It only sealed the entrance again, the way it had sealed it before the landslide of May 2nd, 1903, briefly exposed it to open air, and to a rancher who happened to be close enough to hear the ridge come down. There is one further detail in the surviving record that sits beside everything else without resolving any of it. In the summer of 1922, almost 20 years after the Kirby Creek collapse, a cattle inspector named Harold Foss was working a boundary survey in the upper reaches of the same drainage, several miles above the original landslide site. He was mapping the range boundaries of 2 adjoining ranches and working his way along the base of the ridge on foot. At a point roughly 3 miles north of the site Prewitt had first entered in 1903, Foss found a spring he had not encountered in previous surveys of that area. Springs are not unusual in that country, but this one was. The water came out of the rock cold, as springs do, but the air above the spring's surface source, where the rock face was damp and open, carried a current that moved outward from the opening rather than inward. Foss noted this in his boundary log because he had never encountered a spring vent that pushed air outward in summer, when the pressure differential between a cold underground space and the warm surface should draw air in, not push it out. He moved on and completed his survey and did not return. His boundary log for 1922 is held in the Hot Springs County Records Office in Thermopolis, where it was filed at the completion of the survey and has not been cited in any subsequent document. The spring Foss described would sit, by the coordinates he recorded, approximately 3 miles north of the Kirby Creek cavity and at a substantially lower elevation, on a line that runs roughly consistent with the northward bend that Bracht documented in the chamber's interior wall. Emil Bracht's field notes and survey plan sit in a cardboard box in Riverton, Wyoming, held by a woman who knows what they are and has let 2 researchers examine them in the past 30 years. The plan he drew of the chamber, with its slight northward bend and its question mark penciled at the threshold depression, has never been published. The Eastern Shoshone oral accounts of breathing places in the Owl Creek Range, recorded by Omar Stewart in the 1930s and archived in Boulder, have been catalogued but not examined alongside the Kirby Creek County records because no one has yet placed those two collections in the same inquiry. The mineral samples George Oldys collected from the dressed walls and the dark floor stone went to clients in Casper who dissolved their consortium without explanation and left no account of what the samples showed. Thomas Canfield inspected the site for the federal government and was transferred out of the state 8 weeks later, and his field report disappeared in a reorganization that touched one office and no others. The ridge above Kirby Creek is still there. The debris field at its base has been undisturbed for more than a century. The winter snowpack still releases hard into that drainage in the years when the accumulation is enough, and the stone of the Owl Creek Range still moves under the slow pressure of freeze and thaw. There are researchers who study the oral traditions of the Eastern Shoshone. There are geologists who map the stratigraphy of the Owl Creek uplift. There are archivists who know where Emil Bracht's granddaughter keeps that cardboard box in Riverton. None of them are working on the same question. The room with the fresh air and the worn threshold and the dark floor stone laid over a gap that dropped farther than a 4-foot surveying rod is sitting inside a Wyoming mountain, sealed again under the weight of a century of additional collapse, breathing or not breathing through whatever passage connects it to something below, waiting for the next spring that brings the snowpack down hard enough to open the ridge one more time. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.